So, hi everybody. This is Student Attitudes Toward Content in Higher Ed, and that is the title of this one makes no mistake about what we're going to discuss in the next little while. I'm going to put my water down. What we're going to discuss in the next little while. Before we started, I just wanted to give you a minute and a half on the book industry study group. We are very much BookNet Canada's counterpart in the United States, and this is our new mission statement, actually, recently revised. And the point of this is that this is what we do. We facilitate innovation and shared solutions for really the entire supply chain. So we represent everybody. Amazon's a member, the independent bookstores are a member. Random House is a member, the Independent Book Publishers Association is a member, and some of their members, and so on down the line. And we do what we do in three main areas of endeavor. Standards and best practices kind of at the heart of what we do, and we work really closely with BookNet on standards. Almost everything we do in standards we often do in collaboration with Noah and his team. Education and events, and what we're going to discuss today, research. That's just a thumbnail of who we are. I'm happy to talk more about it offline as well. So we have a number of research reports. We're actually just published. We're in the process of conducting research onto the subscription model of selling books, sort of the first kind of desk research that we've seen done like that in the way that we're doing it. We'll present those results at Book Expo at our conference there. And other smaller research reports, but we're going to talk about three today. The main one is Student Attitudes Toward Content in Higher Education, and I'll describe that in a second. We have a companion piece called Faculty Attitudes Toward Content in Higher Ed. I'll talk about that in a second. And then lastly, we pull some data from BookStats, which is what we do in partnership with the Association of American Publishers. It is the only extrapolated size and scope view of the U.S. book industry. So we look at the industry by category, by format, and by channel. We're going to focus almost entirely on the first two. What this study is it's something that we've been doing. We're in volume 4 now. It's ongoing twice a year, the fall semester and the spring semester. It's a survey of U.S. college students. As I said, we're in volume 4 now, so we have 4 years of trend data. This includes all kinds of higher education institutions. And then, as I mentioned, there's an accompanying survey that we do of faculty in the spring. So the student panel is, I think it's around 1,500 students each fall and each spring. The faculty, we get a much bigger pool to draw from, and then we try and get about that size number of respondents. It's not the same colleges, it's not the same courses. From a methodology perspective, when we talk to the students and we ask them questions about how they interact with course materials, we tell them, consider the first course you take on Tuesday every week. If you don't have a course on Tuesday, the next course in line. Because we need a certain bit of randomization there. So obviously the faculty and the students are not necessarily answering for the same courses, but the results seem to work enough that we do think it's a valuable companion piece. Like all of our research, like everything we do, this is sponsored. We always need to give a shout out to our sponsors. Now, let's dig into the data. So, not surprisingly, the textbook as course material, as a learning material, is on the decline. But it's been a very slow decline. And what we're asking here is whether or not it's required. So we're asking students, are textbooks required for your course? And you can see that fewer than 60% this past fall said that textbooks were required. And that, in fact, more than 10% said that there were no formal course materials required. And that number of textbooks being required for courses has been going down consistently. And you can see that here. You can see the last 3 falls in a row. That's sort of the top graph there. We also ask about whether or not other kinds of materials are required. We're going to get into that in a little bit. One thing I think that is interesting to note is faculty gives a different answer. If you ask faculty if textbooks are required, it's a much higher percent that do. And that perception among students is really important because it says that they are now thinking that they can get through the course without the required course material in some manner, or they can source the course material from someplace else. So you can see that this is the light-colored line is faculty saying that one or more textbook is required for the course, and of those who say no formal course material is required, almost no faculty say that. So there's a disparity between what the students think and the faculty think. How much of this is born in the fact that we're not asking about the exact same course? We think it really averages out over the course of this statistically, as do our partners who help us put this together. So I think it's just really a difference in perception. So students still prefer print. This has been on the decline as well. It's been slowly eroding over time. And you can see where else they have a preference. And digital textbook is up at 16%. Digital textbook means a lot of things in this study. We're going to focus a little bit later on what we call integrated learning systems. So why do they prefer print? When you look at this, I think what becomes interesting and apparent is that the students prefer print not because of a rejection necessarily of new technologies. It's more based on established habits and conventions. So I prefer the look and feel of print. I'm used to ease of bookmarking and highlighting. It's because I'm used to bookmarking and highlighting. So I don't think this necessarily speaks to a rejection of new technologies. Yes, a small, well, not a small number, but the lowest on this list was a bad experience with digital. A lot of that are people who had experience with digital that was a straight PDF of a textbook. And the utility of that, in fact, is fundamentally different than what's becoming available now. So I think the notion of a sort of a straight ebook conversion of a textbook with little additional functionality is a blip on the timetable in the history of what this will become, and it's evolving into something else. So the point, though, is this is more based on, we believe, on established habits and conventions. We ask them how they acquire their course materials. A plurality are still buying the book and selling it back. And that ability to sell back, this is exactly the same in Canada, yes? The buybacks, okay. Is a huge deal to the students. And they're very price conscious, as we'll see in some of the later slides as well. And I should just stop and tell you, so I love data, and I love charts and graphs. If you don't love charts and graphs, it's just a lot more of this. So, most of the students are still buying the physical book. That's the vast majority, and the biggest subset of that group are buying it and selling it back. However, rental, the third thing down the list there, especially rental of the physical book, is very much on the rise. And we have seen that not just in this last year, but consistently over the course of this study. Renting digital books a little less, and certainly buying digital books less. And then there is some, the 3% of smart asses who try and get by without the course materials at all. So what motivates students in terms of acquisition? There's no surprise here. It's money. It's the price of the book and the delivery cost are the first two things. Delivery speed is also important, and we'll see how that impacts where they're buying it as well. When you look at the data from this, digital course materials have a higher perceived value than do print. 63% of students who purchased digital texts were satisfied given the price that they paid. When you ask the same question about physical textbooks, it's 43%. So there's a perceived value in the digital text versus the print text. The number of students who have had experience with digital textbooks has been consistently on the rise. That's not a surprise either. But more and more have had an experience. So it's not quite a majority yet, but my guess is either by the spring semester this year or by the fall semester next year, it will be that at least half will have had experience with the digital text. That's a significant thing because it means they're being trained in a very different way. When you look at those who have used digital and sort of correlate it with other answers, and this is the group that was satisfied, right? Who's the group that's satisfied with digital? Those who were more satisfied, their answer was above what the average was. You can see that they're most likely upperclassmen and grad students. MBA is a big thing on here. Those who pay for their own course materials, and those who have had experiences with integrated learning systems, which we'll touch on in a minute too. So those who are going digital are more satisfied tend to be the more experienced college student, and maybe the more driven college student because they're funding this on their own. So this is also not surprising, but the next two, this and the slide after it, to me are really interesting. So this is what kind of devices do they own? And you can see that the two lines that are on the decline are laptops and desktops. Okay, they're declining slowly. And you can see that there's a real rise in smartphones, and we singled out the iPad and the Kindle Fire here. However, how are they using those devices? Are they using those devices for coursework? They're not. You can see the tablets are hardly ever being used for coursework. Hardly ever. They're still using their laptop and their desktop or their netbook. And we're not entirely sure of this yet, but it probably has something to do with the kind of material that's been made available to date. So students are increasingly likely to have a smartphone in their pocket or a tablet in their bag, but they're no more likely really to be using that to complete their coursework or to review course materials. And that's something as publishers to think about. If it's a direction you want to go or you want your product to be digital, how do you get students to engage there? And it really then becomes a little bit about the functionality. Where are they getting their books? This was surprising to us. Campus bookstores in the US are actually trending up. And maybe even more surprisingly, Amazon was trending down in terms of purchases. Now, some of this, when you look back at their motivation for those who use print, which is still the overwhelming majority, are getting print in some form or another. They're either buying it and keeping it, buying it and selling it back, or renting it. That's the vast majority. Speed of delivery was really important. And a lot of them, and if you talk to college students, you ask, well, why did you buy from the campus bookstore? It's, well, I wasn't going to get it in time for class, because they're buying books the day before class or 2 days before class, and they need, they want and need the book. So this was surprising to us. We expected the trend line to be reversed, and this is something we'll continue to watch as we do this study going forward. Textbook rentals were just the opposite. Almost 19% of students now indicate they prefer rental over purchase, and 22% rent the physical textbook most often for their classes. 5% rent a digital textbook. And when you look at their source of rental, we're seeing the opposite from the purchase sources we looked at for those who are actually purchasing the book. Amazon has taken off quickly since getting into the rental game and continues to grow. Rental is a clear current and future trend in acquisition. Now let's discuss the clearest current and future trend in format, which is integrated learning systems. So raise your hand if you've heard the term integrated learning system before. Okay. So this is how we define it. What we did in our study is we didn't put the name in, but we took this definition, a version of this definition, and we asked students, what is this? Can you tell us, give this a name? We wanted to see if integrated learning system was in fact something students were familiar with. And we got back a lot of things that were not integrated learning systems. This is not something, as we think about it, that is in the consciousness of students. They know it when they see it, and we'll talk about how they use it or interact with it. But the survey suggests that there's a branding problem, and maybe there's a standardization problem, and maybe there's a consistency problem. And that as publishers want students and faculty to be aware of integrated learning systems, and there's good reason for them to want to, I think we will see, we're going to need to see some better branding and packaging and helping describe what these things are. It may just be a matter of time as well. When we look at Integrated learning systems, more than half of students surveyed have now taken at least one course that is utilized in ILS. When we ask how much it is used, is that students have used the ILS believe it is somewhat, at least somewhat, it's a format that helps them improve studying and even letter grades. So it's improving learning outcomes, and that's the big takeaway from this whole research. And I'll get to that at the very end, but this is not about device or platform, this is about learning outcomes. We asked faculty, how likely would you be to purchase digital course materials if we asked students if the faculty was recommending digital course materials, how important is that for you? And the more than 80% said they're either likely or very likely to purchase digital course materials if the instructor is recommending and facilitating the purchase of content. What we've seen in higher ed is a little bit the inverse of what we've seen in trade publishing in the US. Trade publishing, the move to digital or the growth of digital, has largely been fueled by retailers and consumers. In higher ed, it has not really been fueled by faculty and students. It's been fueled by publishers. It's just the opposite. And in fact, faculty have been fairly slow to come to it. Students have been slower than we would have expected. The big US education publishers want to go in this direction. They see a lot of reasons to go in this direction. Faculty influence here is incredibly important. At the same time, when we ask faculty if they alone are responsible for selecting the course materials, more than half are. So when you combine those two things, that the faculty has such huge decision-making power and has influence over the students, it's important then to look at the motives of faculty in choosing course materials. The most important thing is their familiarity, right? That they've used a specific edition of a specific course material in the past, and that obviously the pedagogy in the book is important to them. They do consider the cost to students. They do, to some extent, consider the services provided by the publisher, but look at where there's growth here. Or even lack of growth, the ability of online quizzing and tutoring, self-assessment. We expected that to be the reverse trend, and it was not. So we ask if they're likely or not likely to teach going forward. Faculty that have used an integrated learning system, not surprisingly, are much more likely to use one again in the future, because it has proven to be a valuable thing for both the faculty and the students. So I'm going to turn now away from the kind of materials acquisition, and we're going to talk about something else. And first, I have a quiz. So, what do those three people have in common? They're all pirates. That's right. The only pirate we have to worry about is Timmy. And in fact, when you consider piracy, again, trade versus higher ed, it's much more prevalent in higher ed. So what we want to talk about, what we look at in the survey, are both illicit acquisition behaviors and attitudes toward copyright. And I know copyright's been a big thing here in Canada, so we can dive a little deeper into this. So when we ask students how they acquire, if they acquire content through photocopying a friend's textbook or downloading non-sanctioned content or buying an international version of a text, we can see that it has been on the rise consistently from the beginning of this report. And here we're looking at students who say they engage in this behavior at least occasionally. Okay, so that's what we're looking at here. And we also, when we ask them if you're doing it or someone else is doing it, a much higher proportion say they know of someone else doing it, which suggests that they're not necessarily being entirely truthful. And you can see here from fall to spring, from February to June, that photocopying, most things rise from fall to spring. And so the February, by the way, is when we publish the fall semesters. June is when we publish the spring semester. So it's really, so the dates might be a little confusing. February 2012 was a fall semester. Yes. By spring, we have seen consistently over the report in the spring semester, it rises. We also see a significant rise among upperclassmen. So the longer you've been in college, the more likely you are to engage in acquiring your content through some illicit means. Photocopying has been consistently the number one, if we go back and sort of look at this. But everything is really on the rise. We then asked them this question. So this is how it was phrased. As you may know, copyright protection gives the creator of an original work exclusive rights to it, usually for a limited time, and limits how the work can be distributed, for example, copied. In your opinion, to what extent should the creators of each type of content below be protected by copyright from unauthorized distribution of the creator's work? And the gray bar is not at all, the sort of teal bar is to a limited extent, and that purplish bar is to a large extent, meaning gray bar, no protection at all, purple meaning they should be protected to a large extent. And this is what US students thought. And interestingly, they felt a little warmer and fuzzier about copyright in film than they did anything else. But it's really fascinating to look that the single biggest answer tends to be to a limited extent. So students' perception of copyright is that copyright, it matters, but to a limited extent. And a lot of this is, what you would think of maybe as kind of the Napster effect. And I know Napster's a little dated now, but I think that has sort of carried forward as students routinely get their music in some way other than paying for it. And I think we are training them, society is training them, that it's okay to do that free is okay. If it's available, it's okay to get it. This was sort of this is the first time we asked this question, by the way, so we don't have any trend data yet, and this was a fascinating thing for us to look at. We will be trending this going forward. Again, not surprisingly, when we ask, when we break down the answer to that question by those who answered not at all, the ones who said that copyright protection should not be given at all, like I don't care about copyright at all, the ones who answered not at all were much, much more likely to get their content in an illegal way or an illicit way. You can see is almost as high as 90% in terms of photocopying. Where the survey average was less than half. So the attitude toward copyright was leading directly to the illicit behavior, which suggests that there is perhaps work to be done on educating about the value of copyright. That's a very tricky thing. I don't know how much of you guys followed in the U.S. last year when our Congress was considering two bills to strengthen copyright, SOPA and PIPA. And the online lobby got very heavily involved in energizing people to protest the passage of those bills. And the bills, which seemed sure to pass early on, the support collapsed because there was such a hue and cry from people who had been energized by Google and others to fight it. So there are a lot of big corporate interests that are also fighting copyright. And by the way, I sound like I'm very much taking a view. I'm not necessarily. The point is that it's happening and that there is a certain erosion of copyright. And what that erosion of copyright is doing attitudinally with students, it's encouraging them to acquire their content in a means other than what you would want as a publisher them to do. Me fail English, that's impossible. But I think you know what I meant. So, when asked who suggested one of the aforementioned illicit behaviors, most commonly it was a roommate or another student. But look at number 4 on the list. It was instructors, it was faculty. 15% of the time in this survey, students said, yeah, the idea to get an international version of the text or to photocopy something or to pull it down from a peer-to-peer site came from faculty. That's fairly stunning to consider. I'm not sure what we'd do with that, but there you go. As you would expect, money is also a driver here. The top 2 reasons that drive illicit behavior are related to price. If this is something, again, we need to get our heads around, books would have to be less than $50, printed textbooks, to get students to purchase them instead of copying or downloading according to the results of this survey. Most are looking for a price in the $20 to $40 range. That's what we got back from students. That's where their perception of the value is. When we ask, are textbook prices reasonable considering their value? We ask that explicitly. More than half disagree with that statement. Maybe it's not as big as I would have thought given the previous slides, but it's still a majority who think that they're not getting the value for the money. And then if we ask, are you willing to get an older edition of the book if you can save money? That was overwhelmingly true. And we also asked faculty that question, and faculty actually had the same thing, that they would encourage students or recommend to students that they get an older version of a textbook if it would save the students money, depending on how much it changed. There is a perception among students that the changes in textbooks aren't numerous enough or substantive enough to justify the expense of buying the new book. And you can see with this with almost 70% saying that they would purchase an older edition to save money. Now, I think that what I think are the two money questions in this survey are this and the one that will follow. The vast majority of students would pay more for course materials if they felt the course materials would improve their results by at least one letter grade, right? That's their focus, is I want a better learning outcome, and that outcome specifically in the form of a better letter grade. Almost 80%. Very few disagreed with it. Likewise, if this could cut their study time by a quarter, they would also spend more. Again, 3/4 of people said that. So, in other words, students are willing to spend on products they perceive as having value. And they perceive value as increased studying efficiency and better letter grades. So we spend a lot of time at conferences I go to. There seems to be a focus on platform and device and technology. And that's just the wrong focus. I don't think that's just true for higher ed. I think it's true for trade as well. The focus is on the user. And what the user in higher ed is telling us, is that they want an improved learning outcome and to save time because they're time stressed. And as we're developing new products and new tools, that should be at the heart of everything that we're doing. That should always be what we're thinking. Well, thank you, everybody.